very much.
Thanks, Ben. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I understand I'm just before lunch, so I'll try and make this as interesting as I can. I guess no technical presentation would be right without a good old Dilbert cartoon. So this graphic from Dilbert, this actually kind of highlights my last couple of decades within the industry of that battle I constantly see within development and security teams. You know, the application development team are focusing on speed, application functionality, get the job done, get the business and revenue, and security, you know, are almost seen as a bit of a blocker. But thankfully, times are changing. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, especially around APIs and what we're seeing here at F5. Now, let's look at a question first. What is the most valuable asset of a modern enterprise? Now, go back a couple of 100 years, and that was really physical capital. You know, if you were the Henry Ford, the Andrew Carnegie, the Rockefeller of your day, you know, you had physical things, physical capital. You had cars, you had steel, you had oil, and these were really valuable assets. Now, move forward 100 years or so, and that kind of morphed into the existence of service-based industries. So, you know, many businesses, that meant human capital was a real valuable asset. People like, you know, the McKinseys and the IBMs employing very smart people providing services. Move forward again to today, and we've taken on another shift. We've really moved to what we would call at F5 an application capital. You know, look at the big web monsters, you know, look at the Airbnbs, you know, arguably the largest hospitality industry don't own any hotels. Facebook don't actually have their own content. Uber don't own any taxis. These businesses were all built around the process of application as their capital, using that data to grow their businesses. Now, where does this, you know, kind of sit for F5? So I guess I should give you a quick 50,000 foot view of F5 and who we are and where we sit, just so you've got a bit of a background. Now, F5 are a bit of a category creator. We were set up in the mid-90s. We were the leader in load balancing. I say were because we kind of created a new category of application delivery controllers in the mid-2000s. And that came from not just providing load balancing at, you know, layer 7, but adding these other kind of services you can see on the list here. So things like application security and DNS and DDoS. Move forward to where we are today, and we've changed the category again. We're really talking about multi-cloud application services. And, you know, we've acquired a few friends along the way. So the logos you can see below are actually part of the F5 family now. So Shape Security is part of our artificial intelligence and security, and also Nginx, which may be a bit of a shock to some people because most people know Nginx as the open source code. Nginx running over 300 million websites, according to TechCrunch. Over 60% of the top websites, you know, sit on the Nginx open source code. So F5 have embraced that open source journey and become part of that with the Nginx acquisition. And that becomes important with what we're talking about today, because you can see some of the services that Nginx provide are around things like APIs. So, you know, from a holistic view, between F5, Shape, Nginx, you know, we're providing a set of application services, you know, to give you a development through that entire life cycle of your application. So that's enough about F5 and where we are. Let's kind of talk about what we're here to talk about today, and that is around applications APIs. Now, if we look at the state of application services, we found a huge amount of our customers talk about how they've already deployed API gateways. And there's a reason behind that, is because, you know, the applications that we work with today are fundamentally changing. If we look at traditional applications where a client had a browser, they made a request to a web application, they got some HTML back, and that information was rendered through a standard, you know, HTTP request response. Look at where we are in today's environment, and that has moved into an application where the server is used really to kind of proxy data. The client is now the rendering component, not the server. The client effectively is utilizing APIs to expose the underlying implementation of the app. And that means the app doesn't truly live on the server, because an API can be configured to communicate with many, many third-party providers. We can use things like delegated authorization to make that possible. And it's actually less work for developers as well, because they really have a more simplified language to deal with. That data construct is effectively what we call JSON, JavaScript object notation, and that can be manipulated through JavaScript, which is arguably the language of the web. Now, another driver we're seeing around the the heart of API deliveries is microservices. Something that a lot of the guys in the fintech world will be very used to hearing, and that is moving that application from an old monolithic style application, maybe an old 3-tier application where we had a traditional web tier and a database tier and an access tier, and moving that into a distributed application made up of its smaller component parts. So from a fintech world, that might be the accounts registration page, it might be the account page, it might be the transfer page, it might be the different functionality that sits behind them. Move them into a containerized service and mesh these all together into a service mesh using microservices. The thing is, these microservices need to talk to each other, and you've guessed it, fundamentally they talk to each other through REST APIs. And there are many, many different ways to do that. We won't get into the the technicalities on that today, but just to understand that that's also a huge driver. APIs aren't always just external coming in. They can also be what we would call maybe east to west traffic, internal traffic, going within your organization, within your application. Now, going to where we are, on open banking and the drivers around that, it's kind of created a bit of a perfect storm. We've got a real willingness from consumers. They're willing to share their personal information for actually a better product. They're willing to give you their application capital so that they can have their product tailored to them. We've seen situations where fintech services are using third-party APIs, third-party services like if this then that, so consumers can do interesting things where they're at. It might hook into a weather channels API, and when the bank sees it's raining in your particular postcode, it can take some money and put it into a savings pot. All of these things are driving the willingness of consumers to give over their data via that API so they can have a better product. Obviously, regulation is a big part of that. The Payment Services Directive and the Competition Market Authorities, really pushing that change so that we can have our data opened up via the API. There's the background kind of radiation of the growing digitization, huge adoption of smartphones that we've seen over the last decade, meaning that people can access very, very powerful applications, within their hand. And the speed of internet, obviously, to back that up, 3G, 4G, and now 5G coming forwards, means that's a real driver, for pushing the types of applications we're seeing today. And then the final point here really around competition. This source was from McKinsey. Now, they were talking to 80% of their customers, said they're actually looking forward to financial products, not by banks or new banks or even new fintech, but by tech companies. We've seen this as well. We've seen Google partner with Citibank. We've seen Apple partnered with Goldman Sachs, so they can launch credit cards and bank accounts. But the consumers are more aligned with their tech companies than they are with the banks today. So, that could be a real competition for fintech and something that you've got to get your head around. But going back to the underlying driver behind all of this, it's APIs, application programming interfaces. It's what makes all of this possible. Now, you can kind of think of APIs as a little bit like an iceberg. There's the bit poking out the top that's exposed that people can access, but there's a whole raft of services going on underneath. And I mentioned, that's what F5 do. We provide application services, from that code to customer. And you can see just the amount of services that are required to get an API up and running and stood up. You have to make sure it's available. You have to be able to, provide metering and billing, at the same respect. You might have to revoke access. So there's the authentication side of things. There's authorization. There's also documentation. If you want people to interact with your APIs, they need to be well documented. So there are standards around for that, like the Open API spec and the Swagger format that allowed Open APIs to be formed. And also, just like any website, you don't want your API to go down, so it needs to be scalable. And all of these are kind of functional designs, but they're also designs that need to be taken into account of when we're talking about nefarious traffic and attack type traffic. Now, the impact of having that API that's exposed to the outside world, unsecured, can be very costly. We've all seen, the big hand of GDPR come and slap a few companies recently. There's been a few people that have been made an example of. There are hefty fines involved with exposing and losing customer data. And, the API is just another chink in your armor, really. Now, by 2022, Gartner is saying there's talking about APIs being the most frequent attack vector. And if you think about APIs, they're not really designed for human use. It's not like you're accessing them an API directly with your browser as you would be maybe a website. They're often set up for machine-to-machine communication. But what we're seeing is permissions that are set up for this kind of original requests. These permissions are in turn passed to the API. And that's just one of the problems we're seeing around APIs today. Now, F5 Labs, which is F5's security and research arm of our organization, they've been tracking some of the API breaches over a number of years now, nearly a decade. And you can see as this kind of timeline fills up, the breaches and the type of attacks that are directly associated with APIs just getting more and more crammed, because it's fairly obvious as we expose our services through APIs and more technical innovation and more business revenue is defined through those APIs, then they're going to be another surface vector for attackers to use. And data is data. GDPR won't differentiate whether you lost your data through your front-end website or through a back-end API. It's still a data loss as far as they're concerned. Now, one of the things, the messages of old in the security industry is, never use security through obscurity. Obscurity, just because, no one knows your API is there, shouldn't really be a fundamental basis for securing that API. And we said this in the previous slide, API is designed really for connecting computers. It's still quite common for development teams to assume that, humans aren't going to find it and access it. And that's just not the case. Now, last year's application protection report from F5, one of the things we looked at was root cause incidents from APIs. And you can see that big bar on the left there. A third of API incidents over the last couple of years were actually just caused by no authentication. Now, we're not saying this is a particular problem with any vertical sector, and one of the things we found, especially talking to our fintech customers, is because of that drive and that well-defined standards around PSD2 and open banking, we see much less of the zero or no authentication on the APIs, because there are requirements to, push that through things like mutual authentication or token access. But you can see here, it's not the only area of authentication attacks. We're seeing bad authentication, bad authorization, that notion of least privileged access, not really taken, and misconfiguration, still high up on the list. And we talked to some of our customers about the no authentication. They said, well, look, we're mandated, as you mentioned, from the SSL side of things, we have to do mutual authentication, but actually that leaves us blind because we're doing mutual authentication. We're exchanging SSL certificates between a client and a service. We can't then look inside that SSL and do things on the network that we used to do. So they may use kind of token authentication. So one of the mechanisms and more popular mechanisms, getting a little bit more technical now, is something called a JOT token or a JSON web token. Now, we don't need to go into the hows, whys, and wherefores of this, but just to say it's a very web friendly. It's a base 64 encoded piece of text, and when you decode that text, it's not encrypted. You just decode it. This is the information that you get from these three different parts that I've color coded here. So you get some information around how that JOT token was created, what algorithms were used in securing it, the interesting bit for an attacker, the payload, and then the signature. And again, we're seeing a couple of different issues around here as well. So one of the things we're seeing is, just by design, providers giving too much information within that JOT token. And they may not, instead of just giving what we call token claims around the name and the account ID, they may be giving things like internal IP addresses of servers, or notes from, that shouldn't really be in part of an access token. And then all of this is kind of digitally signed with a signature. And it seems we've kind of stepped back 10, 20 years, because we've found people using signature and encryption standards, which are, by today's kind of day and age, are relatively easy to brute force. So, just because you're using tokens, you still need to try and keep a heads up on that. Now, for an attacker, an API itself, it's a path to something else, right? It could be a path to another partner, one of your customers. It actually could be a hook into a hardened piece of infrastructure that's back in your, banking infrastructure, that's actually not reachable any other way. We call these pivot style attacks. And, the connective nature of APIs means that, these target attributes are really, they're not as important. What's really important is baseline controls. And the standards and the security available to protect these are already existing. We're not talking about massive technical or security innovation here, because these are effectively web requests. They are HTTP request and response. They use HTTP methods, get, post, patch, put, and they receive data. That data tends to be formatted in JSON, JavaScript object notation, easy to read data. So, as I say, we've had the ability to protect these in things like identity and access management and web application firewalls for many, many years. Now, if we just go through maybe an example, I tried not to pick on the fintech world here, and I've used something that everybody knows, so Uber. There was a vulnerability discovered by a firm called AppSecure last year. And this really kind of just highlights one of the easy ways that data manipulation and data sanitization can be used. So they did a proof of concept where you could send a post request to an API call that was on Uber. Now, remember what I said about APIs before. One of the main things is having them well documented, because you want people to interact with your APIs. So all of this stuff is not hidden. It's well documented, what the APIs are, what the resource endpoints are, what a successful request should look like, what a failed response would look like. All of this information is there for anybody to go and look at, especially on a developer portal. And they had the idea, well, what if we send a phone number or an email, with some information that doesn't exist? And what they got was a failure message. This is a failed message, but the interesting thing was that failure message from Uber was actually including the driver ID for that particular telephone number. So they used this driver ID, this kind of unique user ID, to send back to Uber on a different API resource. And again, expecting a failure, and that's what they got. But that failure also included lots of PII around that user ID. So the email, the access token, date of birth, etc. So yeah, massive leak of information here through a single API channel, through, chaining together a couple of very, very simple requests. So you can see just how easy it is. You don't necessarily have to be hacking back-end systems and code. It could just be a question of business logic and trying to work out how that API works and looking what data is exposed from it. Now, I've been working in the application security sector for a couple of decades now, and one of the big names that always comes up around AppSec is OWASP, so the Open Web Application Security Project. And most of my customers I talk to have heard this around protecting web applications because they produced the OWASP Top 10. Well, quite recently, they also produced an OWASP Top 10 for APIs because they also saw, how prevalent these were becoming, and how the top risk vectors were being used over and over again. So this is the OWASP Top 10. We can kind of broadly break these down into different areas around authentication, access control, app security, reporting. So if we take these into a kind of traditional three-pillar approach, really what we're saying is AppSec, your control mechanisms are already there. Most customers have WAFs anyway. Access control, if you haven't already, which is very unusual for companies exposing APIs, utilize your API gateways for that, whether it's JOT token authorization or mutual authentication, and also make sure you have visibility and administration. And from an F5 point of view, this all comes back to that service exchange. Where do we fit as an organization? And it all depends on customer use case. Because as we mentioned, applications are changing. They're not the traditional, 3-tier. So in a lot of cases, having that front end gateway to do those security checks is going to be beneficial. But you may need to have security within your Kubernetes pods, as per pod proxies or per service proxies, as part of that microservices architecture. So, just be mindful of that. The other thing to be mindful as well is that make sure that the security that you implement can be supported by your development and operations team. And by that, I mean, you can shift left with your security. The security that you implement can be implemented as code. Your policies can be infrastructure as code. Make all of this, as automated as possible, so that the modern tools that you're utilizing to deploy your applications and your APIs, you can deploy your security with that. Now, from an F5 point of view, that kind of culminates in an architecture where you can have that two-tier approach, where we're using things like Nginx, which are very small and lightweight. You can spin one up in a container under a couple of megs, and they're doing the routing, the authorization. And we have a security gateway where maybe customers have a traditional big IP. So let's kind of wrap this up so we've got 5 minutes left, maybe answer a few questions if there are any. And, do a shopping list. What can we do? And I've kind of split these down into 2 areas. Begin this week, do it now if you haven't done it already, and begin this quarter. And begin this week is absolutely around that authentication. Just based on the historical data we're seeing, you've seen that no authentication is a problem. And then that sanitization of data. As I say, most organizations already have the tools. They have web application firewalls. So, pull your API requests through those web application firewalls. They're just HTTP requests and responses. You can still do the same level of data sanitization. And then look at, really kind of invest on your security program maturity, not fancy bells and whistles, but really kind of, lock down. So do things like, take an inventory, be like a hacker, scan your own network, scan your APIs, look for APIs that you didn't even know were there because they were set up as tests and forgotten about. I mentioned this shift left earlier, your API security shouldn't be an afterthought. If you can make the implementation of a WAF policy as part of your code, you can push that in as part of your build. And we spoke about removing developer info, so the removing just additional info as well. We saw that example with Uber. Rate limiting is a fairly obvious one. you can still get DOSed just because it's an API. If APIs are fundamental to your business, then make sure that you have some level of denial of service protection there. And validate input is absolutely crucial. If there's one thing we've learned from web application attacks in the past couple of decades, is that injection by not sanitizing user input is top of the pops. It's number one. It will cripple you and bring you to your knees. And then not so much of a problem in the fintech, because we see everyone is mandated to use SSL. But just because you're using encryption, even if you're using mutual authentication, there's still ways to break open that encryption. Whether you're using products from F5 like SSL orchestrators or other vendors, having the ability to pop open that SSL so you can do those checks like data sanitation, absolutely important. So look, that was short and sweet, 27 minutes there, I think, actually on time. I think we've got a couple of Q&As. I would ask you, we've got a booth here today at Fintech, so if there's any questions around what we've talked about, I know it was not too in-depth and it was a bit quick fire, but please come over to the booth. We've got some people manning us there. We'll quite happily take any questions you might have. And then Ben, I see we've got something on the Q&A there.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our audience members asking for 5G enterprise type of offers. Can you please, please can you comment on API security?
I mean, all I can say from that point of view, from an API security, there's nothing specific around, 5G that would be different to what we would provide from an API security. Now, how we implement that 5G security, F5 have a whole team around, service provider at F5 and GI LAN and radius and diameter protocols that are all kind of very relevant to the 5G and service provider world. But that fundamental providing of the API security doesn't really change much, or at least from our perspective anyway. Brilliant. Well, I can't see any more questions. I'm not sure.
No more questions coming through at the moment. We have a question from Barney Nib. What do you think of the open banking APIs? They were created very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the open banking APIs, there's a framework around, what you should be doing with your APIs that's provided by open banking. And I think the problem with frameworks is there's always a bit of room for interpretation and how things are done. And I think that's the important thing. So, I'm not going to say anything's good or bad, but when you're interpreting what should be done, I'd go back to that last slide, focus on program maturity. A lot of our customers have tools there. Some of them just aren't even switched on, or they haven't even thought about bringing their APIs through the same channel that they've been bringing their web requests through. So yeah, I'd go back to that point there, really.
Perfect. Do we have any other questions from the audience at this moment in time?
Oh, it looks like we're bang on time. So, someone's mentioned SOAR. So I mentioned SOAR before. So that's F5 State of Application Report. So I mentioned about F5 Labs is our security and research arm. F5, like many other vendors, we produce a state of application report. So if you want to go and look at that, just go to F5 Labs and you can go and download a copy there. And another one there, how is network security and API security fit together? Closely coupled is what I would say there. Your APIs, although they are applications, effectively, they're still traversing your network security infrastructure. So access control on your identity and access management devices, whether that's federated authentication. There's still, we mentioned about DDoS, so still being able to do rate limits, quota limits, spike arrest, things like that. And fundamentally, a lot of web application firewalls sit within that network security team, even though they're looking at application data. So, very closely coupled. And that's the key thing, working with security with your application teams there. Fantastic. Good stuff. Well, I can't see any more questions. So, as I say, I will be around on the F5 booth. So, just like to say thank you very much all for your time.